How's it everyone who's watching this? This is my 83rd video on the channel, and today we're beginning a repeat of an older project, the series of videos on Félix Guattari's seminars. Recently, I signed a book deal to publish a set of Guattari's seminars under the title A Field of Fuzzy Possibles with Edinburgh University Press. As I work on refining my manuscript, I've been wanting to take another look at them and make some more in-depth videos. For today, we'll be looking at the fittingly titled Introduction to the Seminar, where Guattari explores all sorts of things, from what assemblages can broadly be defined as, to what the aim of his project in general is. Without further ado, let's get into it. Guattari begins the seminar by making it clear that his aim is purely and simply to find ways of moving forward in his schizoanalytic work. Rather than just proposing concepts for the sake of it, he wants something more pragmatic.
You see, there's a certain threshold past which I don't give a fuck about discussing the things I put forward. If you think otherwise, that's fine. Instead, I want to see if they can work.
With this in mind, he starts outlining what schizoanalysis actually is. The first point Guattari makes is that schizoanalysis isn't quite a distinct discipline like psychoanalysis, at least not exactly. Instead, it hangs about a little everywhere. On a bare-bones level, schizoanalysis is defined by Guattari as the study of the impact of machinic assemblages on a given problematic. Breaking this down, a given problematic can refer to many things, from a work of art or fantasy to a clinical presentation. The term machinic assemblage is likewise quite broad, but its purpose is essentially to allow for a broadening of what psychoanalysis associates with the unconscious. To be more particular, the psychoanalytic unconscious, specifically its Lacanian flavor, is generally quite a determinate thing. It has to do with subjectivity, drives, affects, and so on. Semiotic elements that communicate meaning, for example, are usually pretty important. However, in schizoanalysis, there can be important things, machinic assemblages, that have absolutely nothing to do with subjectivity, or drives, or affects, or even semiotics. The result is that what Guattari is seeking to explore is decentered in relation to the unconscious of psychoanalysts. It cannot be reduced to it. The last detail to interrogate in the definition that schizoanalysis is the study of the impact of machinic assemblages on a given problematic is what it means to study. Because of just how varied the concept is, Guattari gives a pretty ambiguous answer. Essentially, studying is something that can be either explicit, like what a psychoanalyst does when dredging through the dreams of an analysand, or implicit, like when children in a classroom reveal something about opportunity in a neighborhood. As a result, schizoanalysis has largely to do with what Guattari calls analyzers.
They can be, in institutions and the system, individuals or collectives that are objectively, if I may say, in the position of analyzers of machinic assemblages.
These analyzers are frequently not conscious of their role, which Guattari considers to be incredibly important given that schizoanalysis does not just focus on interpretations of specific utterances and contents, but instead also focuses on the assemblages that give rise to those utterances and contents in the first place, assemblages that analyzers help shed light on, working flush with what they simultaneously explicate. Because of the attention the framework gives to the assemblages that produce or enunciate utterances, that is, Guattari's famous assemblages of enunciation, Guattari explains that there are a few ways to approach analysis. The first is pretty intuitive for those familiar with psychoanalysis. You just analyze the givens, the data, provided by the problematic, be it a person, group, or artwork. The second is a little more interesting though. This time, you look at what connects and produces the givens that can be analyzed. When doing this, there's a very specific problem linked to trying to work out what function as non-explicit assemblages of analysis. Analyzers like the children in the class, as well as others like a gang or a comedian, might not always play that role. They may only do so in very specific circumstances. When following this second analytic choice, you have to try to determine what those very specific circumstances are. The occasional tensions between these two choices can be found in the case of Little Hans, a 5-year-old boy with a phobia of horses, analyzed indirectly by Freud. For Guattari, the case has to do with a very rich array of analytic assemblages, involving various tiers like Hans and his father and his mother, Hans all alone, and perhaps Hans and his neighbor. This produced something of a rhizome, a web of analyzers. However, taking the first choice, Freud came in and basically crushed it all. His interpretations focused just on the givens of a case, ignoring their production. This was especially problematic, given that he never met Hans in person, instead communicating via letters with his father. In Guattari's own words,
"There was a whole rhizome of analytic assemblages which were squashed by the central interpretations of Professor Freud, bringing everything crashing down."
Whilst he only touches on it in passing, there's also a third analytic choice, exploring what he calls the field of possibles, uncovering previously unknown avenues of radical change. These do not belong to the set of givens, but rather manifest as what Guattari and his close friend Moni El-Qaim call singularities. A singularity doesn't really mean anything specific or special in the therapeutic situation, but quite simply stands out in some way. By amplifying singularities, whole new possibilities and assemblages open up that, before, did not seem available. The problem that Guattari faces now comes from an audience member who asks him whether it would be possible to simply systemize the process of making analytic choices. Essentially, with schizoanalysis, it isn't really a case of knowing exactly what to do. You're often dealing with some pretty hard to grasp things after all. Instead, it's important to find ways of avoiding biases that could lead to foreclosing pathways that could actually prove useful, dodging, for example, some of the traps linked to classical psychoanalysis or family therapy. As Guattari puts it,
"With the best of intentions, sometimes we don't notice ourselves forbidding the entry of a line of work tied to machinic assemblages simply by waiting for them at one place whilst they arrive at another."
Moving on from the importance of keeping an open approach, Guattari now turns to what exactly falls under the label of assemblage. As he makes clear, assemblages don't need to include components of signifying semiology, involving language and narratives, subjective and intersubjective phenomena, or consciousness. For the sake of examples, he offers a taxonomy of 3 kinds of assemblages: those that are non-semiotized, those that are semiotized but non-subjective, and those that are subjective but non-consciential. The first case, the non-semiotized assemblage, can be said to include stuff like the endocrine encodings that the body uses for hormonal matters, as well as the nervous system. These are non-semiotized insofar as there isn't really any expression substance or content substance that belong to them. You don't have hormonal signifiers after all. This all changes with the second case, that of semiotized but non-subjective assemblages. Here, we find phenomena like what Freudo-Marxist psychoanalyst Wilhelm Reich described as character armor. For Reich, the body semiotizes in certain ways with mental illness, manifesting in tensed muscles, blushing, and so on. However, the expressions and contents involved are not really subjective, properly speaking, and in fact, the whole point of armor is to stop unwanted or painful emotions from joining with the subject. With this, we get to the final case listed here, that of subjectivized subjective but non-consciential assemblages. These are pretty broad, with what are generally called instincts falling under their umbrella. Unconscious imprinting, jealousy, and so on largely play out on a level separate to the conscious, but still implicate the subject in some way. Taken together, we can see that Guattari's assemblages go far beyond the models of most psychoanalysts. As he himself relates, a Lacanian or Freudian might very well object at this point declaring that even if Guattari's unconscious exists, it's completely separate from the kinds of things that psychoanalysis is interested in. There don't seem to be any signifying chains for one, not to mention the possibility for subjectivation or becoming conscious of what's going on. However, quoting Guattari directly,
For my part, I would say that the unconscious I'm talking about is split into two parts, or that there are two unconsciouses, and naturally they are part of the same field.
the unconscious that Freudians and so on usually focus on is what Guattari describes as the molar unconscious. It deals with firmly delimited subjects and objects, functioning through language, narratives, and identities. Nevertheless, it's not the only one out there. Guattari is fascinated by a second unconscious, which he describes as molecular machinic. This one deals with codes, imprinting, reflexes, and so on, where instead of distinct subjects and objects, or linguistic semiotics, the main processes at play are those of what Guattari terms machinic enslavement. I've gone over machinic enslavement before on this channel, mainly in my series on the book Science and Machines by Maurizio Lazzarato. But, if you aren't familiar, this basically has to do with when people, or whatever else, stop engaging with things as users and begin engaging with things as components. Parts of a person enter into function directly with a broader machine, working flush with other mechanisms. The example that Guattari always gives is that of driving whilst tired.
Everything works outside of consciousness. It's all reflexes. Then there is a semiotic signal of awakening that in one fell swoop makes you regain consciousness and re-inject signifying chains.
The molecular unconscious sort of underlies the molar one, hence the names, although with the caveat that the relationship isn't really one of scale. For now though, the important point is that machinic enslavement does not have anything to do with subjectivity, properly speaking. Instead, it works on a level where subjects and objects can't really be distinguished, and where, instead of signification passing meanings from one person to another, everything is asignifying. The passage from this to the molar, where you go from being enmeshed with the car to having a full identity as a user of a vehicle, entails essentially breaking through into the realm of signification once again. For an audience member, Jean-Claude Pollack, Guattari's case here seems to be reprising some earlier work on desire. He asks Guattari whether the molecular dimension is that of heterogeneity, chaos, and so on, being organized into what Lacan would be more comfortable calling the unconscious through a process of marking. The context for this issue is the position held by certain Lacanians that those with a psychotic structure, that is, those who don't engage with signification in supposedly normal ways, lack an unconscious. Although Lacan was a bit more nuanced, saying instead that psychotics have an unconscious, just a non-functioning one, not all his followers took the same route. By distinguishing an unconscious separate from the signifying rules and regulations that define the molar, Guattari, in Pollack's eyes, seems to basically be widening the field for psychosis. To paraphrase him quite closely, he sees the molar molecular division as a partition between systems of signification and what lies beyond them respectively. What is quite interesting here is Guattari's response. Whilst he broadly agrees with Pollack's reading, he makes sure to underline that the molecular isn't chaotic per se. If you're at all familiar with Freud himself, psychoanalysis often distinguishes between two intertwined modes of psychical function, the primary processes and the secondary processes. In the case of the former, the drives work to give out a free flow of energy, seeking pleasure in a chaotic way that has no regard for reality. In the case of the latter, the secondary processes effectively just rein in their primary counterparts, imposing controls that stop things from getting too out of hand. Pollack, somewhat indirectly, invokes the primary-secondary division in his account, but Guattari is not quite comfortable with that approach.
I do not think that there is a level of chaos or just any nature whatsoever. It isn't because we escape digitalization that we fall into chaos, that we sink into indifferentiation.
Digitalization in this context has to do with the process of marking that defines the Lacanian unconscious. What Guattari is getting at here is that the molecular unconscious is in no way an undifferentiated blob. They aren't quite signifying systems or what have you, but that doesn't strip the processes involved of their complexity. Machines with very exact semiotic functions intervene, such as in the example of falling asleep whilst driving. There wasn't really chaos there. Rather, there was a certain machinic process that blurred the line between the driver subject and the vehicle object. This ties into another important point about desire in Guattari's view. It's important not to think of it in economic terms, at least not as if flows are general things that can be exchanged in quasi-financial ways. Guattari is very insistent on the importance of heterogeneity, where diverse systems and machines come together without some sort of exchange value playing a part. In this view, subjectivity doesn't arise from some transcendent guarantor that persists across time and space. Rather, the subject exists at the junction of a whole range of assemblages that are in no way fully stable. This takes us to an example that Guattari seems to like a lot, that of a professional singer who, after the death of her mother, loses the ability to sing in a couple octaves. Every assemblage has its own way of contributing to subjectivity, and if one loses consistency, its related process of subjectivation can fail. With the singer, her octaves, her ability to stay in key, are dependent on what contributes to her being a subject. As Guattari puts it,
Junction creates her subjective consistency. When she has a reason to get up, to say something, and so on, it's the putting into connection of certain assemblages, and not others, that is at work.
the loss of an assemblage contributing to such a junction can result in two main kinds of so-called subjective subsidence. First, there can be a shrinkage phenomenon, where things like skills retreat back a little. Second, and more severely, there can also be a black hole phenomenon. With this, whole other sectors of a person's subjectivity can just cease to function, resulting in major symptoms. With the singer in question, she is experiencing shrinkage. The changes in her range aren't quite on the level of a symptom or an inhibition, stopping her from singing at all, for instance, but rather mark a restriction. She only knows to recognize what's happening because of her job. While some of Guattari's audience are not too comfortable with the idea that not being a singer wouldn't have changed anything, he stresses repeatedly that an assemblage losing consistency can cause subjectivity to fade without those holding it realizing what's happening. Returning to the car example, we see this in how hard it sometimes is to realize that you're tired or falling asleep. It's dangerously easy for subsidence to occur right under your nose, where effort is required to work out what's happening before it's too late. Moving on just a little, it is here that Guattari draws a line between his assemblage theory and traditional psychoanalysis. A big thing motivating all of this theorizing is a desire to turn away from transcendence and towards immanence, where the focus isn't on universal homogeneous mechanisms, but rather singular and differentiated ones. This is why Guattari stresses that the singer's experiences after the death of her mother can be explained in terms of certain assemblages losing consistency, rather than some generic process of self-punishment or identification. An assemblage has very particular relationships with space and time, as well as with all sorts of affects and emotions. When it subsides, there is thus a similar shrinkage or black hole felt in those relationships. Ending this part of the seminar, Guattari states,
Clearly, this explanation is a lot less pleasant, it's a lot less magical than systems of identification, introjection, the bad mother, punishment, the death drive, and I don't know what.
Here, Guattari turns his attention towards how relationships between assemblage components are to be understood. With the singing example, as Pollack points out, vocal, musical, and familial elements that seemingly had nothing to do with each other manage to link up in a pretty notable way. To explain this scenario, Guattari proposes two preliminary modes of connection, that of echoic black hole phenomena and that of components of passage. Beginning with the former, the echoic portion refers to how the most diverse things can enter into a kind of destructive feedback loop. Quoting straight from the seminar again.
Behaviors start echoing, marching in step as if on a bridge, causing it to crumble in a catastrophic fashion, a result of entering into the same binary black hole rhythm. It's shit. It doesn't work.
There's something general about this echoic black hole, in the sense that it doesn't matter what exactly the phenomena that enter into it are. Just the act of falling in rhythm is enough for a stomach cramp to join up with an obsessional representation, hence the language of a black hole that sucks everything in the first place. However, the situation changes completely with components of passage. Here, not just anything can be implicated. Rather, there are certain margins that allow for one element to enter into concatenation with other elements, and these margins have to be delicately studied. Whilst Guattari doesn't linger too long on components of passage for now, this idea of particular productive connections gets pretty important later on. At this point, it's time to shift gears a little and look at another of Guattari's biggest targets when it comes to psychoanalysis, the concept of the drive. There's often a distinction, sometimes implicit, drawn between unconscious infrastructure and a superstructure that depends on it for our conscious actions. However, Guattari is absolutely opposed to this. Instead of drives or instincts, he prefers to discuss coded behaviors, phenomena linked to fight or flight, forming groups, and so on. These are not the support for a superstructure, but rather intervene directly in the subjectivity of people. In other words, there is no mediation or distance between the subjective and the quote-unquote instinctual. On this ground, Guattari goes as far as to reject the notion of need altogether, illustrating his point with hunger.
There are all sorts of anorexias. There are people who stop eating like this, like that, because it bores them, because it tires them. There are people who go on hunger strikes.
His point here is that you can't separate instinctual assemblages from social ones. There's an intimate relationship that can't be reduced to the unilaterality of need driving the subject. Hunger, to paraphrase Guattari, exists at the intersection of social, geopolitical, and economic elements, having various particular forms and reasons emerging from their junction. Pollack is immediately skeptical. He points out to Guattari that, no matter what, we need to die. There's seemingly a limit to the rejection of needs. In response, Guattari stresses that social encodings still interfere with biological, ethological, and ecological issues, which Al-Qaim supports, with some work he read about the deaths of drug users. Their so-called needful death, or the limit at which they died, is not something individual. On the contrary, it crystallizes through all sorts of social, familial, and institutional events coalescing. If we draw this discussion out beyond need alone, we can begin to get at Guattari's broader critique of the psychoanalytic drive. Its basic anatomy, as presented here, involves four elements: a source, a name, an object, and a mode of expression. The source is propped up on a theory of needs, being the origin of a pressure that puts the drive in motion. To use an example from early Freudian theory, one of the self-preservation drives, or ego drives, has its source in the constant production of hunger from the stomach. The same general principle applies beyond this limited case though, appearing with what can more easily be identified as sexual drives too. Turning to the aim, this is often understood as the push to relieve a sort of tension. Guattari is skeptical of how psychoanalysts approach this dimension in economic terms, acting as if tension and the aim of reducing it are simply constants that can be understood purely quantitatively. As we'll see as this series continues, his own views heavily stress the heterogeneity of such systems, where there is no room for basic equivalences or economics. For now though, if we turn to objects, Guattari's main concern is the delimitation of what drives focus on. For Freud, drive objects generally are pretty specific to the body, the breast, the anus, so on and so on. With Lacan, however, what Guattari terms an integral was developed, where his concept of objet pétier came to describe the somewhat vague something that exists in the most diverse objects and pushes us to desire. This was a step in the right direction, but as Guattari states,
in any case, his algorithms always return objet pétier to the drive, whether we like it or not, re-establishing, in my opinion, a kind of infrastructure.
In this context, Guattari is critical of the Lacanian approach to objet pétier because it's still too restrained. He doesn't like how uniform everything is, which only worsens when we get to the final component, representation. Here, there's a heavy focus in psychoanalysis on the idea that drives don't directly communicate. Rather, there has to be an intermediary in the form of drive representatives, which often undergo repression. This concept is nowhere to be found in Guattari's assemblage theory, where attention is squarely on modes of semitization. The various components involved in the singer's range of octaves, for example, aren't repressed when her mother dies, but rather stop semitizing as they used to. The result of this approach is essentially to get rid of any inequality in how things are tiered. To go beyond even just the drive and its actions on the conscious, let's look at dreaming. The processes of semitization that are at work when you're asleep are in no way latent or below those of wakefulness. They're simply different, functioning with their own mode of consciousness and syntax. When you stop dreaming, you don't just translate what happened into a new, higher level of wakefulness. Instead, there's a passage into another set of semitization processes. To close off this half of Guattari's first seminar, the main question he seeks to explore is how we can understand the act of passage that moves us between assemblages. Borrowing his words,
without us being able to translate elements from one assemblage to another, it is certainly very useful to try identify what passes and what doesn't, which is entirely different from making an interpretation.
It's on this note that we conclude one half of Guattari's introduction to the seminar, which will hopefully be published relatively soon in A Field of Fuzzy Possibles by Edinburgh University Press. I truly hope you enjoyed or learned something, and if you feel I got anything wrong or wasn't as clear as I could have been, please do feel free to let me know in the comments so I can do better. Next time, we'll either be continuing with this seminar or returning to Signs and Machines by Maurizio Lazzarato. Until then, bye.